Hey, Edgar Allan Poe
I forgot that.
fits the mold of the transcendental hero in a bunch of different ways. You remember when we looked at Whitman that insights into the future of art are like insights into the future of morality. Beauty is all we know of truth and all we need to know. Poe breaks new ground in almost everything that he deals with. As a poet, he invents the mystery story, the form of the mystery story, all the way down to today. The brilliant detective who mentally solves the crime after being presented with a series of clues which are presented simultaneously to the reader, which he then uses to solve the crime, and at the end of the story he not only tells you who did it, he tells you how he figured it out. He has the not too bright assistant and a friend slash rival who's also not too bright, usually in the form of a policeman. If there were no, that's Auguste Dupin. If there were no Auguste Dupin, Poe's detective, there would never have been a Sherlock Holmes. And the whole mystery genre probably wouldn't have developed the way that it did. So he breaks completely new ground in that. Some people give him credit for having written some early science fiction, Descent into the Maelstrom, and where he goes in a whirlpool and ends up in another world. Manuscript of M. Valdemar, where a guy dies under hypnosis and so he doesn't actually die. You could see that as a science fiction or horror. What he does with the horror genre itself is ahead of its time. Prior to Poe, unlike today, the horror story was a legitimate form of literature. Now it's genre fiction, it's like science fiction or romance. It's not treated like it's real literature. No matter how well Stephen King writes, he will never, never win a National Book Award, and certainly never the Nobel Prize, because he's written horror, and so he's never going to be taken seriously as a writer. But when Poe wrote, horror was a legitimate genre. The beginning of the Romantic movement brings the Gothic novel. And the Gothic novel is usually usually deals with the supernatural, with the isolated and terrible, with wild nature, all the stuff you would expect from Romanticism. And until Poe, the horror story is just that, supernatural. The scariness comes out of the other world. Houses are haunted, there are evil ghosts, there are demons, unexplained but somehow malevolent circumstances. Poe changes horror and makes it psychological rather than supernatural. When we look at the Follow the House of Usher, it starts out like a haunted house story. He talks about all of the stones and the moss and the lichen that grow on it, how they've been there in that order for so long that they've formed a kind of organism, and the house itself is evil. As you'll see, it's not really a story about a haunted house at all. Well, we'll get to what I think it's about anyway. There are lots of interpretations of that story, which is another thing that Poe does, which is to leave the interpretation up to the reader more than anybody before him. He doesn't turn it into just a story about a haunted house. The story's really all about drug addiction. Roderick Usher's drug addiction in particular, which, as you'll see, is Poe's drug addiction. That's another thing that Poe does, beside moving the horror over into the psychological, as in, for example, stories like The Black Cat, where you have a guy who's telling you that he's been put in jail and a big mistake has been made, and he'll clear it up for you in a minute. And you think he's perfectly sane and you're willing to listen to him. And a third of the way of the story, he's telling you how he took out his penknife and cut out his cat's eye, and then he hanged it, and then finally chopped his wife in the head with an axe and walled her up in the wall. And somewhere along the line there, you notice this guy is crazy. And you didn't know he was crazy. And if you can't tell a homicidal maniac from an ordinary person in a story, how often in the day do you come up against that and not know who it is? Not only that, but the guy was a perfectly nice guy before he began to drink. Americans almost all drank, and drank heavily. so that could be running into the narrator of that story at almost any time and not know it, and it might even be you, which is the scariest thing of all. So he moves it over to the psychological, and often the stories, even the horror stories, express Poe's own psychology. More than, I guess more than anybody else we looked at, except Whitman, Poe brings his own personal experiences into the story. The difference is, and this is something that makes Poe look like a modern writer, is that he disguises them as symbols. A lot of them are his own wish fulfillment. For example, the Castle of Amontillado. A guy feels he's been insulted by another guy. He wants to get even with him. He tells him he has a cask of Amontillado that he bought. He's not sure it's really Amontillado. This guy's a wine connoisseur. Would he help him? Then he says, no, never mind. Don't help me. I know how busy you are. I'll get your friend Lucrezi. Well, this guy hates Lucrezi, so he knows he's going to go down. He's going to sample the wine. Takes him down layer after layer after layer down to the sub basement. And when he gets in there, pushes him into a little niche, chains him up, and then walls him up brick by brick. And laughs at him as he puts in the last brick. It's a horror story, certainly on the face of it, but it's also about Edgar Allan Poe. Poe, there were lots and lots of people that Poe would have liked to have walled up. He just couldn't do it. He was an angry guy for the most part. He felt that he was smarter than a lot of people who had become successful, and that he worked for idiots. Yeah, like he's the only one. And that he felt that he should have been rich. As you'll see, his mother dies when he's 3. He's adopted by John and Frances Allen. John Allen is a wealthy tobacco merchant, a self-made man. Edgar thinks that he's going to inherit. And he's raised as a young gentleman, even though Allen never adopts him. That's really kind of crucial to understanding Poe. The first thing is the loss of his mother when he's 3 or 4 years old to tuberculosis. I mentioned at the very first meeting of the class, I'm pretty sure, about how when you look at Poe's poetry, you see the death of a beautiful woman, blood and gore. And it sounds weird and bizarre until you find out that his mother was beautiful, that she died of tuberculosis, that there's a lot of hemorrhaging involved in that, and his last memories of her are of blood, beauty, loss, and love. That's why he gets those things all kind of mixed up together. Poe always seemed to feel that he was sort of the Dauphin of France who was robbed of his crown. He thought he was going to have a better life, and he certainly thought that he deserved one. But Allen never adopts him. Now, he's a very bright kid. In fact, he has all the qualities that would have made him a star rather than an isolate in his growing up. He's good looking. He's funny. Nobody ever thinks of Poe as having a sense of humor, but there are some Poe stories that would actually make you laugh even today. And they're not even macabre humor. They're not even gallows humor. Good looking, funny, bright, athletic. Generally, you get the picture of Poe as a puny, scrawny guy, pale, wasting away to death. He swam the James River when he was 16 years old. Swim any river, you got to be a decent athlete. When he runs away from home after his first year in college, he says he went to Europe to fight in the revolutions there. All biographers say he never left America. He worked on a coal barge up and down the East Coast until he joined the Army. You shovel coal for 6 months. Even if you start out puny, you're not afterwards. But what separates him from everybody else is possibly, again, for a long time, Poe was the crazy man poet. You know that cliche about the line between genius and insanity being very thin? And he's always pointed up to as the one who went over the line a good portion of the time. And that the madmen in Poe are Poe himself, that he draws on his own periods of madness. And that's certainly a possibility. In fact, he writes the poem about his isolation If you look at Alone, and I think this argues on the side of Poe's having had a psychotic break. Now, you remember how common manic depression is. Schizophrenia is also fairly common among writers. He's isolated as a child. One of the things that frustrates his desire to be popular is the fact that when he is back in America, when he's between I think 6 and 10, they go to England, and Allen enrolls him in school as Master Allen. But when they come back, he enrolls him in school as Master Poe. So what does that indicate about their relationship? That they're estranged now. He's not really thinking about adopting Edgar. When Edgar goes to school as Master Poe, this is Virginia, this is the South, this is the antebellum South, where family is everything. Well, Poe's mother was an actress. An actress was about a step or a step and a half above a hooker. It's not any family that anybody of those Southern aristocrats would want to be associated with. And so that's really what keeps him. And if Allen had adopted him, that would have legitimized him in a lot of ways. But he doesn't. And so he's isolated in that regard. But he's also isolated probably because he is such a bright guy. And he's a bright kid. Well, if you're a genius and you're 10, how does that sit with your peers? And not very good. They don't like it. You scare them. Everybody, a frog gets squashed on the road. All the other 10-year-old boys are poking with a stick, looking to see its insides. And you're talking about whether there's a life after death, and do we all rot and end up like this, or is there a soul or not? All your friends are going, "You're creepy, Edgar. Let's play with the frog some more." He just couldn't seem to fit in. Also, if you're very bright, you tend to have interests and understandings beyond the kids your own age, and that makes you an isolate. Also, he seems to have a pretty depressive personality pretty much all of his life, maybe for good reason. I mean, he loses his mother young and he never gets over that. And as you'll see in this poem, he talks about how what they're sorry about, what they think is a tragedy, he compares the real tragedy, and so he can't really relate to them. But I also think this is a poem, as you'll see, about his first psychotic break. From childhood's hour I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone, and all I loved alone. So everything that Edgar likes is different than all the other kids, and that makes him isolated right from the beginning. But this instance that he's talking about is a specific event in his childhood. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life. Now, he did lose a whole lot of people that he loved. Almost every woman that he fell in love with died, most of them with tuberculosis. He lost job after job. He doesn't get adopted by Allen. He never inherits. He dies and lived a good portion of his life in poverty. But he was also an alcoholic and probably a drug addict as well. And as you'll see, most of the disasters that befell him, he brought on himself. But you have that classic junkie, it's everybody else's fault attitude towards things that happen to him. Was drawn from every depth or good or ill, the mystery which binds me still, from the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the skies that passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm and the cloud that took the form when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon, in my view. Difference between a psychotic and the rest of us. All right, a psychotic and the rest of you. Is it, you look at a cloud and say, doesn't that look like a demon? What does a psychotic say? It says it is a demon. You might say you're crazy. He looks at it and he sees a demon. Now, let's say that your first break with reality occurs when you're a child and you look up and you see the face of evil, where everybody else can only see a cloud. And you're convinced that that was absolutely real. You can see why he would be paranoid the rest of his life. Maybe part of his drug abuse and his alcoholism was a flight from that terror. And it seems to be pursuing him, this physical malevolence. Remember, seeing physical evil in the world, when we looked at the Puritans, that wouldn't even have been considered crazy. That would have been considered a gift. It's only by the time you get to the 19th century that that seems an oddity. But this may have been a poem about his first psychotic break. So that a lot of Poe's not being able to fit in may be the mental and emotional problems that he has pretty much from early on. He says he just never seemed to be like everybody else. In his growing up, when he's taken in by John and Frances Allen, John Allen is a philanderer. He has a lot of mistresses. Apparently, at some time when his wife knew about it or was hearing rumors about it and he had to appease her in some way, Poe's up for, his mother dies and Frances Allen wants to adopt him. John agrees to take him in, but he never really got close to Edgar. They seem to get along those first few years, but by the time Edgar's 10, the rift is already starting. It intensifies to his adolescence, which is not surprising, and on into his teens when Edgar talks to John Allen, this is a self-made man, about wanting to live off his inheritance, Allen's fortune, and write poetry. Well, what do you think Allen thought of that? Hey, that was an appalling idea. This is a guy who wants a son to turn his business into an empire, not to live off the fruits of his labor doing something as foolish as writing poetry. So they have a lot of fights about that. Also, you can see why, from about 10, the rift starts. You're a guy who cheats on his wife. Why wouldn't you want to have a bright 10-year-old in the house? He sees through stuff. One of the things kids are really great at is they know hypocrisy when they see it. And so John is making these excuses, and Frances is nodding and accepting, and Edgar's standing there going, is she nuts? Even I can see that's a lie. Why would he be lying? You don't know what's going on, but you know something's going on. And so that's got to make somebody like John Allen, who tells a lot of lies, nervous. And so from the very beginning, there's that, the smarter and the older Poe gets, the more he realizes what's going on, the more of a danger he becomes to John and Frances Allen. I mean, they've got some sort of accommodation there worked out. That never apparently comes completely to the surface, but if Edgar brings it to the surface, you could be looking at divorce, and certainly that's something that's hanging over John Allen's head, and it might be why he didn't like Edgar. Also, Edgar has has a good sense of humor. His friend said he makes you laugh all the time. Other people said, oh yeah, Poe's got a sense of humor, but it's always vicious sarcasm. And he picks out one person as his target, and he just humiliates him. And everybody will be laughing at him, but if you're the victim, you don't find it too funny. So I'm sure he said some sarcastic thing at John Allen's expense too, that Frances Allen either didn't notice or probably pretended not to notice. And that's got to widen the rift between them. When he goes away to college, that's when the heavy drinking begins. Surprise, surprise. Now, Poe says he didn't drink. He said he wasn't a drunk. He was allergic to alcohol. If he took one drink, his allergy made him seem as if he were drunk. We probably hear that story still at rehab. 8 out of 10 people who stand up. Other friends said, no, it's true, Edgar only takes one drink. He comes with a bottle of hard liquor, he turns it on end, he doesn't put it down till it's empty, but he doesn't have another drink all night long. His father was an alcoholic. His older brother was an alcoholic. Alcoholism is a disease. It's a failure of second-stage alcohol metabolism. The reason why alcoholics drink not only to excess but often to oblivion is that their body is slow in processing alcohol. Normal people drink to feel the effects. Well, they're feeling the effects of drink 1 when they're on drink 2. But if you're an alcoholic, drink 1 isn't going to get processed for another hour and a half. By the time drink 1 gets into your bloodstream, there are 15 other drinks backed up behind it waiting to get metabolized. Now, in Poe's day, they didn't understand any of that. To them, both drug addiction and alcoholism were a matter of moral character, that no person with a strong will could be addicted to a drug. They probably wouldn't even be attracted to it to begin with. So it was seen as a moral failure to be a drunkard or to be a junkie. He gets thrown out of the University of Virginia, not because he isn't a good scholar, he is a good one. He always does well in his studies, but because he can't pay his gambling debts. He's got something like the equivalent of $25,000 in gambling debts by the end of the year. Well, how could a bright guy lose that much money? Unless he was gambling drunk and they were cheating him. When you read, if you read William Wilson, it's about college days and about a guy who does get people drunk and cheat them at cards. So UVA won't let him go back because a gentleman always pays his gambling debts and Poe can't pay it. You can imagine what John Allen said when Edgar came home and wanted him to pay all the money. Of course, Edgar had a reason. Edgar said, he sent me off with all these other rich kids who had lots of money, and he gave me a pitiful allowance I couldn't live on. And the only way I saw to do anything with that money was to use it to gamble with and maybe make enough. Well, I lost it pretty quick, and I lost more, and I couldn't quit because I'd had to pay off with money I didn't have. So it was all John Allen's fault. Almost all the time when Poe talks about his life, it's always somebody else's fault, which is something, of course, that you expect from an addictive personality. He probably also was addicted to laudanum and to opium. Laudanum is a mixture of opium and alcohol. If you refine opium once, you get morphine. If you refine it twice, you get heroin. So when we look at the House of Usher, we'll be looking at the characteristics of heroin addiction are like the characteristics of laudanum addiction. He uses drugs and alcohol most of his life, but there are times when he seems to be drug-free, and that's important because it's during one of those times when he writes The Fall of the House of Usher. He goes into the army while he's run away. Francis Allen dies, makes John Allen promise to go and find Edgar and make up with him. He finds Edgar. Edgar is risen in the ranks to as high as he can go as a non-commissioned officer. John says, you apparently have a talent for the military. I'm going to get you into West Point. Now, there are 2 people who went to West Point that if you listed 100 people who went there, you would never put on your list. Edgar Allan Poe and Timothy Leary, the guru of LSD from the 60s, both spent a year at West Point. Poe is a model cadet despite the fact that he's 24 and most of the cadets are 15 and 16. He does well in his studies, but while he's there, now he doesn't want to be in the military, he only goes to please Allen, so Allen will leave him the money. But one of Allen's mistresses has a son, then a second mistress has a son, and he marries her. He doesn't invite Edgar to the wedding, so it looks like Edgar's not going to inherit. There's no point staying at West Point, so he gets himself thrown out. He goes to Baltimore to live with his mother's mother's sister, Maria Clem. Also there is his older brother who's dying of tuberculosis and alcoholism and writing poetry. His grandfather, who dies not too long after, whose pension they were all living on. And his sister, his cousin, his first cousin, Virginia. Poe marries Virginia, privately when she's 12, and publicly when she's 13. Now the scandal isn't that she's 13 and he's almost 30. This is the South, and this is the 1830s. 13 was young, but it wasn't as appalling an idea as it is now. What's the scandal? They're first cousins. Even in the South, that's a little bit too close a blood relationship. Something, by the way, that makes him look like a transcendental hero because he looks like an outlaw to everybody else. He breaks the rules, but as a transcendentalist, if you love somebody, genetics shouldn't be that beside. Gregor Mendel isn't even going to write his his book about genetics for another 10 years, so nobody even knows about that. They do know that inbreeding tends to cause a lot of problems, though. Nevertheless, so Poe looks like an outlaw, but he's really a transcendental hero. He seems to stop taking drugs after that for a while, and he gets a job as an editor on the Southern Literary Messenger. Now, he had been writing all along. As the editor, he quadruples the circulation of the magazine. And he's able to do this because of another way that he's a transcendental hero, and another breakthrough, and that's in the area of criticism. At the time, literary criticism was a kind of gang warfare. You praised your friends and you attacked everybody else. Poe establishes in the beginning of the essay, and you can find this in Mosses and his review of Hawthorne's Mosses from an Old Man's. He lays out his critical principles first, and then he objectively applies them to Hawthorne. An objective review was something that now, if you know somebody you're writing a review for, you're supposed to make that clear right in the beginning. And you're not supposed to attack people because you don't like them. You're supposed to state, these are my principles, and here's how he meets them or doesn't meet them. So Poe, in terms of ethics, is 100 years ahead of his time in doing this as an editor. Now, even the people whose work he was critical of still liked him because they felt he was the only reviewer around who was giving them an objective view of their work. And he said, this is what I think a good work is. They didn't agree with him sometimes. They felt, well, given those criteria, this is a fair estimation of my work. I just don't agree with the criteria. But I know it wasn't an attack on me personally, and I know it wasn't an attempt to elevate some people and put other people down. So when he becomes an editor, he can write to those big-name writers and ask them to contribute to the magazine, and they do because they respected him as a critic. He also wrote for the magazines himself, both short stories and poetry. When you look at his poetry, it's another way that he's a transcendental hero, where he has insights into the future of things. Remember that Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson were both very concerned with the musical quality of their poems, how they would sound. Whitman put those printer symbols in for the spaces, for the pauses, for when you would read it aloud as oratory. Emily has the lines that go up, down, and neutral that indicate how the voice should rise or fall and how long it should be held. Edgar, you notice, repeats. Something like what Whitman does, where Whitman repeats parts of a line. Allan Poe will repeat the same line several times in the poem, sometimes a line or two away from each other. Now, those repetitions are supposed to create what he called a hypnagogic effect. Another way he's a transcendental hero, he goes Emerson one better when it comes to thinking about the oversoul. He has an essay called Eureka. You probably wouldn't really want to read it because it reads like the kind of stuff people wrote during or shortly after their first LSD experience in the 60s. It's incoherent babbling for most of it, but it has got every once in a while the basic tenets of this idea, which is that the oversoul, when it put itself into the physical world, fragmented itself and lost its unity, and that ever since the oversoul has been trying to get itself back together, but it can't, because it can't quite remember. It's so much of it is missing, so much of it is here in the physical world, that it hasn't got a full conception of itself. And the only way for it to get back together is for all of us, who of course are the missing parts of the oversoul, to basically to think it back together under the direction of the poet, who Poe saw the same way that Emerson did, as a special person with special insights. The poet can put us into the state where we can remember what we were like as the oversoul. And when we all do that, and the oversoul goes back together and withdraws from the physical world, and the physical world is over. In order to put you into that state, the hypnagogic state is what he calls it, he uses the poems. That repetition is supposed to basically hypnotize you. And when you pass into that trance-like state, you remember the trance-like state is the transcendental state. of the Transcendentalist, is that when you become one with the Oversoul. And he intends to do that with his poetry, which is why often the sense of the poem is sacrificed to the sound effects of the poem. And the sound effects of the poem are intended to put us into this hypnotic state. Now, the hypnotic state he's talking about bears a striking resemblance to the drug state. The drug that he takes, his drug of choice, opium, creates very intense hallucinations and reveries. You don't just remember when you were 6 years old, you become 6 years old and you relive it. You're pretty much helpless when you take this drug. That's why if you go to an opium den, for 3 cents you would get a pipe, the young girl to light it for you, and a bed to lay down in, because once you took it, you weren't capable of walking around and carrying on any kind of normal life because you couldn't tell. Now you get very, very vivid visions. And it's those vivid visions that Poe sees as, because remember, for the Romantics, it's reason that gets in your way. They don't have anything against drugs. Drugs block out the reason, so they're not a bad thing. Those aren't hallucinations. Those are visions of the true world. Even Poe's drug abuse, including his alcoholism, can be seen as the acts of a transcendental hero. If he takes the drugs in order to get the hallucinations, what we would call hallucinations, in order to get the visions that come with them. And he knows that drugs are addictive, and he knows that they're frowned on, and he knows that they're more or less illegal. But if he does all of those to get those insights as a poet, then he's a transcendental hero. He's risked breaking the law, he looks like an outlaw to everybody, but he's following a future morality. And it's not even a distant future morality. I mean, remember Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan under the influence of opium. A lot of the European Romantic poets took drugs. So if you see his addiction or his use of drugs as a weakness which he couldn't overcome, is he a transcendental hero? No. It's only if he made a conscious choice to do this to enhance his abilities as a poet. And he wouldn't be the first poet that told himself that he had to be at least a little bit drunk or a little bit wrecked in order to do the writing. Again, if he's using that as a tool, then he's a transcendental hero even in that respect. On the other hand, it does certainly seem to ruin his life, both the drugs and the alcohol. Because this, Mr. Hicks?
Do you say that they're transcendentalists because they do it for the poetry, or transcendentalists because of the way they live?
No, he's a transcendental hero if he uses that as a tool for his art. But if he just takes it because it makes him feel good and it's a lot of fun, then he's not. Well, actually, I guess he could be a transcendental hero even then. Remember, if it feels good, it is good. You're following your heart.
To who is he a hero?
In terms of that definition of the transcendental hero that we have, that he acts in terms of future morality. He's not a hero in the sense that he's necessarily admirable to us or anybody else. He's what Emerson called the transcendental hero. That special person with special insight and special gifts who leads the way back to the Oversoul. And actually, Thoreau is just you could see Thoreau as just you could see Poe as just a hippie lost in time. I mean, if Thoreau were around writing in the 60s, nobody would have blinked twice at the fact that he was wrecked when he was writing most of the time. That would have been almost expected of him. So he may simply have been acting in terms of a future morality, which again would make him look like a transcendental hero. Now he gets fired from this job. And imagine how annoying he must have been if the publisher, who is now making 4 times as much money, is going to fire him. And imagine how charismatic and likable he was, in that the very guy who fires him writes him a letter of reference. He says, this guy is the best editor in America, if you can keep him sober. I couldn't. He goes for a while without being able to get a job. He's scrambling around. He gets another job as an editor, gets off drugs and alcohol again, and triples the circulation of that magazine, and that's when he writes Fall of the House of Usher, at a time when he thinks he's finally conquered his addiction. If you look at the Fall of the House of Usher, it's sometimes interpreted as a story about incest, but I could never understand that interpretation. So, well, it'll be too late. Professor Callaghan will never wander by to explain to us how it is an incest story, although I don't think he teaches it that way either. What I think this story is about is Poe's own addictions and his own personal state at the time that he wrote it. Several things make me think that this is a story about opium addiction. One of them is, it's one of the very first things that gets mentioned. You'll see in one of the techniques that Poe used in his prose to create the hypnagogic state in the reader. You notice that he wrote that theory of the short story. It ought to have a single purpose. It shouldn't waste any words. It ought to be short. You ought to be able to read it in one sitting. Well, once you say it should create an intense emotional effect, reading it in one sitting almost goes without saying. If you set out to terrorize somebody, but they can only read 20 pages before they have to go to bed, and they pick it up the next day, you've only got the second 20 pages to get them back into that state. You need to have them there for the whole time. That's why I said the short story has to be short. But he's the first one who's theorizing about what eventually becomes the short story. That makes him look like he's ahead of his time. In it, one way to get you into the hypnagogic state is to remove all of the rational landmarks that you could tie yourself to. For example, in the Fall of the House of Usher, where does it take place? What country?
You don't know.
We don't know. And we don't even know where he's been riding for days through the wilderness. From where we don't know, to where we don't know, and all of the houses are gone. There's nothing you can see around that you can identify as the real world. Same thing when he takes the guy down to that sub-basement. Every floor you get further and further away from reality. There are dead bodies and corpses, skeletons and things that start to pile up in the cask of Amontillado. There's only one story of all Poe's stories that has an actual stated location. That's William Wilson, which takes place in Heidelberg in Germany. But all the rest of them are an unmentioned place, and they get further and further from reality. As soon as we start to look at the House of Usher, we're almost into the twilight zone already. Let's take a break until 8:30, and then we'll finish up Poe and do Hawthorne and get the questions.
Are the quizzes already added in, or will they?
No, they're already added in. That's why it may be off by as much as a point, because the one you took tonight isn't in it. Now, if you go to when the Fall House of Usher opens up, we get that supernatural picture of the House of Usher. We don't actually see it. We see it reflected in the tarn. Remember, romantics, like the idealists, see the cosmic world reflected in this world. You'll see him using the techniques of the romantic writer, using words that are meant to stir up your emotions. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low, so oppressively tells you how you're supposed to feel. I have been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country. Dreary again, telling you what your emotions ought to be. And at length found myself as the shades of evening drew on within view of the melancholy House of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. And he says, mostly when you see something isolated like that, a romantic thinks that it's beautiful in its way, because it's the sublime, which is not always necessarily beautiful. But he says this thing was so depressing that you couldn't look at it and find anything good about it. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, which again, at the end of that paragraph, and we'll come back one more time of significance. Upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than. And think of all the things he could have used to compare to absolute depression. The loss of a loved one, the failure to achieve, the bitterness of not having the life he deserved. All the things he could have used, and instead he compares it to no earthly sensation more properly than the after dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. So right away opium comes in. When we look at the House of Usher, it's surrounded by its own atmosphere. I had so worked upon my imagination as to really believe that about the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity. An atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which reeked up from decayed trees and the gray wall and the silent tarn. A pestilential and mystic vapor. He uses that phrase, I think, 6 times in his work, and every time he uses it is referring to opium. Dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden hued. Opium smoke is gray, it's very thick, it's clingy, it doesn't disperse like, say, cigarette smoke does. So the whole house seems to be covered with a fog of opium smoke. There's two people in here, both represent different aspects of Poe himself. One is Poe's junkie side, and one is Poe's non-drug side. It's his, I guess you could call it his normal self. Who represents the normal self? The narrator. Who represents the druggy self? Roderick Usher. And Roderick Usher looks like Edgar Allan Poe. The description of him, the black web-like hair, the poppy eyes, the receding chin. If you put that up on a wanted poster, people would keep bringing you Edgar Allan Poe. Not only that, another link to Poe in the story is the name. Roderick Usher, Poe's mother was adopted by a theatrical family named Mr. and Mrs. Luke Usher. The House of Usher refers not just to the physical building, but to the family of the House of Usher. And they've been decaying from this passing on of addiction from one generation to the next over a long period of time until there isn't much left of them except Roderick and his sister. Poe saw his weaknesses for drugs as being hereditary. Remember, his father was an alcoholic. We also see drugs mentioned in terms of Roderick. His voice varied tremulously. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision when the animal spirit seemed utterly in abeyance to that species of energetic concision, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, and hollow-sounding enunciation, that leaden, self-balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance which may be observed in the lost drunkard or the irreclaimable eater of opium during his periods of most intense excitement. So Roderick acts like a junkie. He's got mood swings. If you look at the characteristics of laudanum addiction, increased awareness of sensation, especially sound. How does that fit with Roderick? Everything about all of his senses are enhanced. He can't stand anything on his skin. When junkies go into withdrawal, the heroin replaces the myelin sheath around the nerves, and so he has his uninsulated nerves, so everything hurts him. He can only stand silk, and not much of that. He can't stand the smell of flowers even. He can't stand any sounds except a stringed instrument. And he can't stand very much of that. His eyesight. Why do junkies wear sunglasses at night? The light hurts their eyes because their pupils are dilated. Well, Roderick doesn't have sunglasses, but if you look at the house, the windows are painted red, they're hung with heavy curtains. The narrator says when you go into a room, you can't see the upper corners. It's so dark and dim. What about a junkie's appetite? Do you find them coming out of Pathmark at 3 a.m. with 3 basket loads full of junk food? No, those are the pot smokers. What's a junkie's appetite like? They don't have any. And Roderick is pale and wasting away. What do junkies look like generally? They're pale and wasting away. Of course, that's also tuberculosis. But in fact, he tells, when he writes to his friend, he says, well, how it's this debilitating disease that's acted on. Physical deterioration. Extended reverie, dreams, and hallucinations. When he paints. Oh, wait, by the way, again, Edgar Allan Poe looks like our transcendental hero is his description of the paintings. If a man ever painted an idea, it was Roderick Usher. Well, 50 years later, painters would be trying to paint ideas, exclusive of representational objects. They try to paint motion rather than a thing in motion. That's the Armory Show. That's the beginning of modern art. So here's, from the description of Roderick's paintings, they would have done fine in the Armory Show. The beginning of modern art was the Armory Show. We had people trying to paint ideas, and you have things like nude descending the stairs, where you couldn't tell it was a nude at all, but it's a series of overlapping figures coming down. So he's trying to paint motion. Well, Roderick's trying to do that too, but it's also Roderick's visions that he has all of the time. Increased inability to tell illusion from reality. Let me hold that for a second. They have no appetite. He has no appetite. They have mood swings. Well, he's already said that not only does Roderick have mood swings, but he has mood swings just like a junkie. What I think is the key in this, in the story is this line. To an anomalous species of terror, I found him a bounden slave. I shall perish, said he. I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus and not otherwise shall I be lost. What's a folly?
Obsession.
It's more than an obsession, it's a foolish obsession. It's a foolishness. Well, a disease isn't a foolishness, but an addiction is a foolishness. There's another junkie in there. Who is it beside Roderick? Madeline. I mean, Madeline isn't even in this reality. She comes in through the door, she doesn't even see the narrator, and she floats out another door like Miss Space Cadet in 1969. The dealer is in this poem too. Where are they getting these drugs? From the doctor. When we first see him, he has a look of low cunning and perplexity. He's sneaky. Why don't they just bury Madeline when they think she's dead?
She would not be.
Well, if they thought that at all, they would have left her up on the bed. He gives a specific reason. He's afraid that they'll dig her up. Doctors couldn't get bodies to practice their anatomy on. So there were a group of grave robbers who called themselves resurrection men, because at the end of the world, the bodies are supposed to rise from the grave, who stole the corpses and sold them to doctors. So they're keeping her until she's too decayed to be of any use. Well, the doctor must be a pretty slimy guy that he would dig up his own patients to experiment on. His perplexity comes from his problem. His problem is that he's got one customer who's on the brink of an overdose, Madeline. If he gives her the drug, she'll probably OD and die, and he'll lose a customer. What will happen if he doesn't give it to her? Will she say, oh, okay, you're right, I should taper off? She'll go into withdrawal and probably die anyway. Will she accept no drugs? No, what junkie would? So she'll go to, who do you think turned who on here? Did Madeline introduce Roderick to the drug or the other way around? The other way around. And Roderick's gotten from his father, and his father, there's been a whole series. That's why you notice that the ushers, one, always marry their cousins, like Edgar Allan Poe, and they're barely able to produce. What's a junkie sex drive like? Non-existent. It's just a means of getting money for drugs. And it's the same thing here. The ushers haven't been able to reproduce. So Madeline would have gone to Roderick and said, we've got to get a new dealer. The doctor's cutting me off. He'd lose 2 customers. So he gives it to her, and she does overdose, but she doesn't die. Now, opium, like when junkies shoot up, they laugh a lot and giggle and talk and dance around. No, they go on the nod and they look like they're dead. They go into that hypnagogic state that Poe's trying to get everybody into. And so does Madeline. Now the narrator says she has a faint smile on her lips and there's a flush on her cheek. Roderick should have known that she wasn't dead. One of the things about this interpretation is that it makes sense of the events at the end of the story. Because when the narrator, and you notice the narrator, by the way, gets more bizarre himself the longer he's in the house. By the time we get to the end of the story, this perfectly rational guy who's reasonable about everything, a storm is coming in, Roderick's freaking out, and the guy's solution is to read to him from Stephen King. Why? What's happened to his thinking? What's the house surrounded by? By drugs, a big cloud of opium smoke. So what has that got to do with the narrative?
He's getting high.
He's getting high from being there. It's the concert high, the contact high. He's been breathing in all that opium for a couple of days, and now he's beginning to hallucinate. He's losing his grip.
What about the incubus that comes to him? Couldn't that be like him smoking opium himself?
The incubus, you mean when Madeline comes back out of the grave?
No, before that, when he's in the room alone, before Roger comes in, there's something about an incubus like sits upon him while he's in bed.
Roderick or the narrator?
On the narrator.
That could definitely be the beginning of those first set of hallucinations. And it would be hard to breathe, I think, for somebody to, this is a very heavy kind of smoke. Yeah, that's a good point. So he's beginning to have the effects early on in the story.
Yeah.
Now, when he comes to Roderick, and Roderick says she's alive, I've heard her from the very beginning. The question has to come into your mind, then why didn't he go down and let her out? Rationally, there's no good reason. However, if he's a junkie, when would his senses be the most acute? When would he be most likely to hear her? When he's stoned. And this is a drug, remember, they give you a bed with because you can't get up and walk around. So he has absolutely no energy. He can't go down and look. When he comes down off the drug, he could go down, but now he's not sure it wasn't a hallucination. He's not going to be in any hurry to go down because if she is dead and he's wrong and it was a hallucination, he's got to open that coffin and look at his sister, and he knows he put her there. He's the one that introduced her to the drug. But he really can't take the risk, so he ought to go down and check. What would any junkie do before he went and did that? Shoot up. And then he can't go. And the next thing he knows, it's Wednesday. And Madeline's been down there for days. Even if he went down right away, they have not only put her into a coffin instead of leaving her up on the bed, he's nailed the coffin shut. What's Madeline's attitude to that going to be? Oh, okay, a little oversight? No, she's going to say, look, you know what we're like under the drug. We look like we're dead. Why did you put me in the coffin, and why did you nail it shut? Where did you think I was going to go? She's going to be pretty angry. And of course, what would any junkie do before they went down and faced that anger?
One more hit.
One more hit, some more medication so I can deal with this trauma. And then of course he can't go, and pretty soon it's too late for him to go. And then of course Madeline, who's well into withdrawal by this time, punches her way out of the coffin, kicks down the big door, and you notice how coordinated this is as he reads. The knight breaks in the door of the hermit's castle at exactly the time that she punches out of the coffin. And then the shield drops off the wall at the same time that the door with its inner coating of copper hits the floor. It was coated with copper, by the way, because that room was probably used to store powder in, gunpowder in. the whole thing becomes, if you were trying to film this, you'd have trouble getting the two things happening simultaneously. Madeline, it gives us a reason why this happens. Now, at the end of the story, what happens to the druggy sides of Poe's personality, Madeline and Roderick? At the end of the story, what happens to Madeline and Roderick? They live happily ever after? No. She falls on him and he dies. She dies. And what happens to the whole history of the Ushers? The whole house of Usher? It falls apart and then it sinks into the tarn. Remember when we first saw it, it sinks into the other world. When we first saw it, it was a reflection. Now in the poem, in other words, what happens to the narrator? Does he die? No. He escapes back to normality. In other words, the story goes, in the process of the story, we go from addiction till there's nothing left but hell. But if you look at the story, right in the middle of it, there's a poem. And at first it's supposed to be in there as an example of Roderick's poetry, but in fact it's the pivot point for the story. It's called The Haunted Palace, but it's not about a building at all. For one thing, it's got 2 luminous windows. How come it's only got 2 windows? The eyes. It's not, so what is it? It's the head. It's a human head, not a palace. The haunted palace is the human head. The skull, the brain is inside it. The spirit, whatever it is that's us, is inside the head. That's the ghost in it. And at first, inside this head, everything is fine. It's a happy land. Banners yellow, golden, glorious. On its roof did float and flow. Blonde hair. All this was in the olden time long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day along the ramparts, the top, plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away, the breath. Wanderers in that happy valley through 2 luminous windows saw. Now to the romantics, the eyes were the windows of the soul. When you look in them now, you see good things. Spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne were sitting Porphyrogene, which means of royal birth, and which the poem meant of the intellect. In state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen. And all with pearl and ruby glowing. So what's the white and the red? If this is a human head. The teeth and the lips. Was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, 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 and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but the same, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. So when we first look in through the eyes, we hear the sound of music, and wit and wisdom comes up. But then, evil things in robes of sorrow. What was Poe's main excuse for taking drugs beside art? The sorrow of his life, everybody he loved fell apart. Assailed the monarch's high estate. All let us mourn, for never morrow should dawn upon him, desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. For Poe, happiness is always in the past, and it's always in the grave, because everybody he loves dies. Even Virginia dies young. She bursts a blood vessel in her throat. Edgar goes completely off the deep end. He's back into drugs again. As a reporter, he goes to interview the president with his cloak on inside out because he thinks the inside looks newer than the outside. This is definitely junky thinking here. He thinks people are after him, they're out to kill him. He's in a complete fugue state by that time. And again, he attributed to that grief. And travelers now within that valley through red-lit windows see. Why are the windows red now?
Bloodshot eyes.
Bloodshot eyes from the drugs. And when we look in now, we don't see wit and wisdom and the organization of logic. Instead, vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a rapid, ghastly river through the pale door, a hideous throng rush out forever and laugh, but smile no more. When we look at the poem, it goes from health to addiction. The story goes from addiction to health. The poem is in the middle of the story and is a reflection of the story as a whole, just the way the reflection of the House of Usher that we saw in the beginning of the story relates to the actual house itself. And in the end, of course, it crumples up and disappears, and all we have is healthy Edgar Allan Poe going on to a happy life, which of course doesn't last. It goes back to being a junkie again. Anybody have any questions or comments on the House of Usher?